New tonight, we're sifting through new documents in a tragedy at sea. It relates to the death of Anna Kepner, the teen who was killed on a cruise ship.
And we've now learned her stepbrother, who's charged with killing her, surrendered to authorities today. Local 10 crime specialist Bridget Matter is live with our top story tonight. Bridget.
What we know is that teen was taken into custody by U.S. Marshals this morning. There's newly unsealed documents that were made available today that are very telling. They say that a judge has concerns that this teen may be a danger to himself or others, and there's concerns he might snap. 16-year-old Timothy Hudson, indicted for the murder of his 18-year-old stepsister Anna Kepner, has been taken into custody. He will be held behind bars while awaiting his federal trial. It comes after his legal team previously convinced a judge to allow him to stay with a close family member under restrictions. But a judge ordered Hudson to turn himself into Marshals Monday morning at a federal courthouse in Tampa. A new court document ordering Hudson's detention references the seriousness of the crimes and that Hudson may be a danger to himself and others. It says, quote, "Indeed, it suggests a level of psychopathy and a lack of remorse that by itself raises a serious concern that defendant can snap at any moment, despite the well-meaning and serious efforts of his caretakers to make sure that does not happen. And the government's case for forcible rape is beyond clear and convincing." Hudson is accused of murder and aggravated sex abuse in the killing of Kepner. The murder happened while aboard a Carnival cruise ship bound for Miami, November of 2025. Investigators allege he tried to cover up the murder, even damaging Kepner's cell phone and tossing it in a trash can on deck. Anna's body would be found the following morning in their shared cabin. A medical examiner determined she died from asphyxiation. Hudson will eventually be transported here to Miami-Dade County, where he will be held in a juvenile facility, and he will stay there until his trial, which is slated for September of this year. We're live in Miami tonight. Bridget Matter, Local 10 News.
A federal judge in Florida wrote this week that the danger he saw in one defendant was something no curfew, monitor, or custodial placement can be trusted to contain. That defendant is 16 years old. The judge was talking about Timothy Hudson, the stepbrother of 18-year-old Anna Kepner. And this week, after months of being allowed to wait for trial at a relative's home, Hudson surrendered to U.S. Marshals. He'll now sit behind bars until a jury decides whether the government is right about what happened on that ship. Because here's what we actually know and what we don't. We know Anna Kepner boarded that cruise on November 2nd, 2025, with her whole family, her father, her grandparents, her younger siblings. We know that 4 days later, she was dead, and that her body was found hidden beneath a bed in the cabin she'd been sharing. We know her stepbrother now stands charged with her murder and with sexually assaulting her. What we don't know, what no one knows yet, because this case hasn't been tried, is whether the government can prove it. Hudson has pleaded not guilty to every charge. So this is not a story about a confirmed killer. It's a story about an 18-year-old girl, a family vacation that ended in a federal homicide investigation in international waters, and a legal fight that's still unfolding right now, over a defendant young enough that prosecutors had to convince a court to try him as an adult at all. This is the case of Anna Kepner. Before this becomes a court case, before the indictment and the federal judges and the detention orders, it has to be what it actually is first, the story of a girl who was supposed to come home. Her name was Anna Marie Kepner. Her family called her Anna Banana. She was born on June 13, 2007, in Florida, which means that when she died, she had been 18 years old for less than 5 months. If you talk to the people who knew her, the same words keep coming back. Outgoing, bubbly, someone who loved cheerleading and loved being out on the water. She was a senior at Temple Christian School in Titusville, a small city on Florida's Space Coast, the kind of place where the funeral of a teenager fills a church. And Anna had plans. This is the part that tends to stop people. According to her obituary, she intended to join the U.S. Navy after graduation and then go on to become a K-9 police officer. She wanted to work with dogs. She wanted to serve. She loved animals, dolphins and butterflies especially. And she loved nearly every kind of music, with one exception. She could not stand heavy metal. She was a die-hard Georgia Bulldogs fan, and her dream was to cheer for them one day. That's the thing about an 18-year-old's life. It's all still ahead of it. The dreams are specific. the Navy, the dogs, the sidelines in Athens, Georgia. The people who loved her describe a kid who was fully, almost relentlessly alive. She made TikToks. She practiced new makeup looks. She built playlists for days out on the boat. She took her younger siblings on outings, to the parks, to events like Halloween Horror Nights, and she was the one who pulled everyone into the fun. Her favorite color was blue. I mentioned that because of what her family asked later. When they held her celebration of life on November 20th, they asked that no one wear black. They asked people to wear colors instead, and many wore blue. Instead of flowers at the service, they asked friends to leave flowers on Anna's car, still parked at Temple Christian School. Sit with that image for a second. A teenager's car in a high school parking lot, slowly covered in flowers, because the girl it belonged to is never coming back to drive it. That's who we're actually talking about. Not a headline. Not a cruise ship death. A real 18-year-old with a car and a college team and a plan to wear a Navy uniform. So here is how she came to be on that ship. On November 2nd, 2025, Anna boarded the Carnival Horizon out of Miami. It was meant to be a 6-night sailing, with stops in Grand Cayman, in Ocho Rios, Jamaica, and in Cozumel, Mexico. A family vacation in the most ordinary sense of the phrase. And it was a big family group. Anna traveled with her father, Christopher Kepner, her paternal grandparents, her stepmother, Chantel, her 14-year-old half-brother, and her 10-year-old half-sister, a 9-year-old stepsister, and her stepbrother. That last person matters, so let me be careful and precise about him, because everything that follows turns on the difference between what is alleged and what is proven. His name is Timothy Hudson. He was 16 years old. He is Anna's stepbrother through her father's marriage to his mother, Chantel. Anna's grandparents would later say that Anna and her stepbrother had been close. But that is not the whole picture, and a responsible telling has to include the other part. Anna had, at times, expressed discomfort around her stepbrother. Her ex-boyfriend has claimed she described an incident in which Hudson tried to climb on top of her while she was lying down. According to that same account, Anna was hesitant to tell her father because, she said, Hudson had knives. Now, those are claims. They come from people close to Anna, relayed after her death, and they have not been tested in a courtroom. I'm telling you them because they're part of the record and because they may matter at trial. But her ex-boyfriend says she told him is not the same as a jury found. Hold both of those things at once. We're going to keep doing that for the rest of this story. What we know for certain is this. When that ship left Miami, Anna Kepner was on it, 18 years old, for ports ahead of her, a senior year, and a Navy enlistment, and a whole life still waiting back on shore. 4 days later, on November 7th, she was dead. Everything in this act comes from court records, most of it from an unsealed federal transcript and the prosecution's own presentation at a detention hearing. I want to be clear about that up front, because what you're about to hear is the government's version of events. Timothy Hudson has pleaded not guilty, and his defense has not yet put its case to a jury. So as we walk through this timeline, hold it the way a juror is supposed to, as an allegation that still has to be proven. The last full day was November 6th. The ship had just visited Cozumel, and that evening the family gathered for dinner. Anna left the table early. She said she wasn't feeling well, a stomachache, and her braces were hurting. She went back to her cabin. And here the layout of the rooms matters. Anna shared a cabin with 2 people, her stepbrother, Timothy, and her 13-year-old half-brother. Her father, stepmother, and stepsister were in a room across the hall. According to the prosecutor who laid out the timeline, a federal attorney named Alejandro Lopez, the hours that follow are where the case lives. Investigators say Anna did not leave the room again after about 7:38 that evening. Later that night, around 12:09 a.m. on November 7th, Anna's 13-year-old half-brother came back to the cabin to sleep. Prosecutors say Timothy stopped him at the door, put an arm out to block him, and yelled that he was changing. The younger boy waited out in the hallway until Timothy let him in. The next morning, 2 things happened that the FBI would spend months reconstructing. The first, Anna's phone. Her family said she was never without it. It was later recovered from a trash can in the aft of the ship, badly damaged, described in court as if it had been smashed. Investigators wanted to know how Anna's phone ended up in the garbage if she never left the room after 7:38 the night before. The second, surveillance footage shows Timothy leaving the cabin at around 9:26 a.m. And then, late that morning, the discovery. A cabin steward entered the room and found Anna's body wrapped in a blanket, pushed under a bed, and concealed by life vests. The medical examiner would list her time of death at 11:17 a.m., close to when she was found. I'm not going to dramatize what that cabin looked like. You don't need me to. What you need to know is that an 18-year-old was found dead and hidden in the room she'd been sleeping in. There's one more detail from that morning, and it's one prosecutors leaned on heavily. After the body was found, with several people now inside the cabin, CCTV captured Timothy walking past the open door. According to the transcript, he looked straight ahead and kept walking, not stopping to see what was happening inside. The defense will have its own reading of that moment. The prosecution presented it as telling. Because the Horizon was in international waters and Anna was a U.S. citizen, this was federal jurisdiction. The FBI's Miami office took the case and met the ship when it docked on November 8th. Agents began pulling surveillance video, electronic key card swipe data, showing who entered the cabin, and Anna's phone records, and interviewing passengers, crew, and family. What they were building toward, the autopsy answered. The death was ruled a homicide. Anna had died of mechanical asphyxiation. There was bruising on her neck, consistent, investigators said, with an arm held across it. And the examiner found evidence of sexual assault. I'm going to handle this next part plainly and then move on, because it deserves precision, not lingering. FBI lab analysis of DNA recovered from Anna's body was reported in court as 120 sextillion times more likely to belong to Timothy Hudson than to an unrelated person. That is the single most significant piece of physical evidence the government says it has. Now, the defense. This is where a responsible telling slows down instead of speeding up. Timothy Hudson has pleaded not guilty to both charges. He is presumed innocent, and that presumption is not a formality. It's the actual legal standard a jury will be instructed to apply in September. A DNA match in a shared family cabin, a walk past a door, a timeline assembled from cameras. Prosecutors say it adds up to one conclusion. The defense's job will be to argue it doesn't, or that it points somewhere else. Until 12 jurors say otherwise, this is an accusation. A serious, evidence-backed accusation, but an accusation. There's also context that complicates the picture rather than simplifying it. After the ship docked, Timothy was taken to a hospital for psychiatric observation before being released to a relative. And court filings from a separate custody dispute revealed text messages in which family members discussed keeping things hush-hush and not wanting their son's name released, with one message saying he can't remember anything. That's the heart of it. What the government says happened in cabin 8343, and the wall of physical evidence and surveillance it's built around a 16-year-old. None of it has been weighed by a jury yet. But the legal fight over whether that jury would even treat him as a child or as an adult, and whether he'd wait for trial at home or behind bars, was only beginning. Here's a question most true crime stories never have to ask. What do you do with a defendant who's accused of an adult's crime but is, himself, still a child? That question has shaped this entire case, and it's the reason Timothy Hudson spent most of the past year not in a cell, but at a relative's house. When the case began, Hudson was charged as a juvenile. And federal law, specifically the framework governing juvenile defendants, generally favors releasing minors while their cases move through the system rather than locking them up before trial. That's not a loophole. It's a deliberate policy choice the system makes about children, even children accused of terrible things. So at a hearing on February 6th, prosecutors pushed hard. They argued Hudson was a danger to the community and a flight risk, and that he should be held. But the judge allowed him to remain free in the custody of his family while he awaited trial. Under the juvenile framework, prosecutors had tried to keep him detained at his arrest and hadn't succeeded. Sit with how unusual that is. A young man accused of raping and killing his stepsister, going home, on conditions, to wait for a jury. Then the legal ground shifted. On April 13th, a federal grand jury indicted Hudson on charges of murder and aggravated sexual abuse. The indictment was unsealed by U.S. District Judge Beth Bloom, and from that point forward, he would be tried as an adult. That transfer changes everything about how the law treats him. As a juvenile, the presumption tilted toward release. As an adult defendant facing these charges, that presumption flips. There's a grim irony worth naming here, though. Being a minor is also the reason this never became a death penalty case. His age took capital punishment off the table. So the same fact, that he's 16, both shielded him from the ultimate punishment and, for a while, kept him out of a cell. With Hudson now an adult in the eyes of the court, prosecutors went back and asked again, detain him until trial. And this time, they found a judge who agreed, emphatically. This is the news that brings us to right now. U.S. Magistrate Judge Edwin Torres revoked Hudson's pretrial release and ordered him back into custody. Hudson surrendered to U.S. Marshals, turning himself in. And it's Torres's written order that's drawn so much attention because of how starkly he described what the government has put in front of him. I'm going to quote the judge carefully here because the exact words matter and because they are his characterization for the purpose of a detention decision, not a jury's verdict. Torres wrote that a defendant now charged as an adult with deliberately taking a human life and sexually assaulting his victim in the course of it presents a danger that no curfew, monitor, or custodial placement can be trusted to contain. On the sexual assault charge specifically, the judge went further. He described the government's case for a forcible rape as beyond clear and convincing. And he wrote that the allegations suggested a level of psychopathy and lack of remorse that raised a serious concern the defendant could snap at any time. I want to slow down on that word, psychopathy, because it's doing a lot of work and it can mislead. That is the judge's language, in a document whose only job is to decide whether someone waits for trial in or out of jail. It is not a clinical diagnosis. It is not a finding of guilt. A detention order asks a narrower question than a trial does. Given the strength of the allegations, is this person too dangerous to release? Torres concluded yes. A jury, applying a much higher standard, hasn't weighed in at all yet. The judge also acknowledged something that complicates the easy narrative. He noted that the people who'd been supervising Hudson had fully complied with every condition of his original release. In other words, his family hadn't failed him. What changed, the judge said, was the legal posture. He was a juvenile when first released. Now he's an indicted adult facing the gravest possible charges. And even in ordering him jailed, the court kept his age in view. Torres directed that Hudson be held at the Citrus County Jail in a facility approved to house juvenile inmates, that he receive a mental health evaluation, and that he be allowed visits with his family. In July, he's set to be moved to a federal juvenile facility in Miami, where he'll stay through the rest of the case. His trial is currently scheduled for September. He has pleaded not guilty to both charges. So that's where the law stands tonight. A 16-year-old, charged as an adult, held until a jury decides, under the words of a judge who looked at the evidence and decided no set of conditions could safely keep him free. But the legal file is only part of what this case left behind. Because while the courts argued over custody and jurisdiction, two families, once joined by a marriage, were being torn in half by it. To understand the grief this case left behind, you have to understand what the cruise was supposed to be. This was the family's first vacation together as a blended family, taken after the marriage of Timothy's mother, Chantel, to Anna's father, Christopher Kepner. Two families becoming one. That's the cruise. That's the reason all of those people were in adjoining cabins on the Carnival Horizon in the first place. Which means the alleged crime didn't happen between strangers. Anna's father is married to the accused mother. The man grieving his daughter and the woman whose son stands charged with killing her were, and in a legal sense still are, husband and wife. There is no clean line down the middle of this family. The tragedy runs straight through the marriage that created it. For most of the past year, that family had to live with something almost unbearable. The young man accused of the crime was free. After his initial release, Hudson lived with his uncle under electronic monitoring, and Anna's father did not hide how he felt about it. Speaking to the press, Christopher Kepner said the family had spent 6 months unable to do anything while, in his words, the accused was free to go where he wanted. He said plainly that he wanted to see his stepson in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, away from any kids, away from women. That's a father talking, not a lawyer, not a spokesperson. It's worth hearing in his own register, because the law's caution and apparent certainty are pulling in opposite directions here, and both are real. So when the detention order finally came down this month, the Kepner family's response was relief. In a statement, They thanked the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the U.S. Marshals for helping place the accused behind bars until trial. They said it had been painful to know he'd been free for so long, and that they were now at peace knowing he couldn't harm anyone else while awaiting trial. And then they said something that pulls the whole story back to where it started. Anna's birthday had just passed, and they spent it celebrating her life together as a family, honoring her memory. Her 19th birthday, the one she didn't get to have. But a responsible telling can't end the aftermath there, with one family's relief, because there is another side of this family, and they see it very differently. Hudson's federal public defenders have largely declined to comment publicly, but their argument in court has been consistent. He is a child, he cooperated with the investigation, and in the months he spent on release he gave no indication of hurting anyone. One of his attorneys told the court he'd abided by every condition of his release for months without incident. And from inside Hudson's own extended family, there's been an even sharper pushback. A relative on his side, Sonia Zisk, spoke to CBS News and turned the question around, asking why the two teenagers were placed in a shared cabin at all, and whether a lack of supervision set the stage for tragedy. She called the arrangement a recipe for disaster and questioned the role of alcohol and missed medication. She also said Hudson's account of that night had stayed consistent throughout. The Kepners, for their part, have denied giving the teens alcohol. I'm including all of that on purpose, because it's the part the formula version of this story would cut. It complicates the villain. But it's real, it's on the record, and a jury is going to hear some version of it. There's even a thread in the evidence that cuts against the prosecution's clean line. Reporting on the case has noted DNA from an unidentified juvenile male among the findings, a detail the defense can be expected to press, and a reminder that the evidence is not always one tidy arrow. Prosecutors recently filed still more material under seal. We don't yet know what it shows. And underneath all of it has run a second, quieter legal battle, the one that actually surfaced Timothy as a suspect in the first place. Before any criminal charge was public, Chantel and her ex-husband, Thomas Hudson, Timothy's father, were locked in a custody dispute over their children. It was in those filings, not a police press release, that the world first learned the FBI considered the 16-year-old a suspect. A family's private legal fight became the keyhole through which the public saw the case. And it raised a question the criminal trial won't directly answer. What happens to the other children in that household now? It's a question the judge raised too, noting that other minors lived in the same home, and that removing Hudson from contact with vulnerable household members pointed toward detention rather than release. Step back, and there's a larger pattern this case sits inside. Anna died in international waters, which is why the FBI, not local police, holds the case and why it's being tried in federal court at all. That jurisdiction is unusual, and it's notoriously hard terrain. Advocacy groups formed by other families, like those behind the International Cruise Victims Organization, have spent years arguing that deaths at sea are difficult to investigate and slow to resolve. Some of those cases never close. This one, at least, has a defendant, an indictment, and a trial date, which, for a death on the open ocean, is not a given. So that's the aftermath as it stands. A blended family broken along the seam that joined it. A father at peace only now that the accused is jailed. A defense insisting the system is railroading a cooperative child. And a web of sealed filings and unanswered questions still waiting on a courtroom. All of it pointing toward one date, and one question nobody has answered yet. Here's where a lot of true crime videos cheat. They reach the arrest, play the saddest music they own, and imply the story is over, that the verdict is a formality. It isn't. A grand jury indictment means prosecutors convinced one side of a room there's enough to charge. A trial is a different thing entirely. So before this case goes to a jury in September, let's be honest about what's actually still in dispute. Start with the evidence everyone points to first. The government's strongest card is a DNA match. Analysis reported in court as overwhelmingly more likely to belong to Hudson than to a stranger. On its face, that's powerful. But DNA in a shared family cabin is more complicated than DNA at a random crime scene, and the defense knows it. And there's a wrinkle the prosecution has to deal with. Reporting on the case has noted DNA from an unidentified juvenile male among the findings. We don't know whose it is, what it's attached to, or how much it matters. But you can be certain Hudson's lawyers will hold it up and ask the jury a simple question. If the science is so clean, why is there an unexplained second profile? That's not proof of anything. It's reasonable doubt's favorite kind of raw material. Then there's what we can't see. In the run-up to the detention fight, prosecutors filed new evidence under seal, describing it only as relating to examinations or tests, with the contents kept from the public. We genuinely don't know what it shows. It could be the thing that hardens the government's case. It could be narrow and procedural. Anyone online telling you confidently what's in a sealed federal filing is guessing. I'm not going to do that. But it's a real, live unknown sitting at the center of this case right now. The third question is the one the whole trial may turn on. What happened in that cabin during the window the two of them were alone? Prosecutors say Hudson and Kepner were alone in their shared cabin from roughly 7:51 to 11:21 p.m. the night she died. And they've pointed to a chilling piece of data. Anna's Apple Watch, which tracked her heart rate, stopped recording during that window, which they believe marks when the crime occurred. That's the prosecution's narrative spine: surveillance placing people in and out, a smashed phone in a trash can, a watch going silent. But notice what it is and isn't. It's a powerful circumstantial timeline. It is not an eyewitness, and it is not a confession. Hudson's side has said his account of that night stayed consistent throughout the investigation. What that account actually is, the public hasn't heard. The jury will. The gap between the government's reconstruction and Hudson's own version is the territory the trial gets fought on. There's a fourth thread, and it's the most delicate, so I'll tread carefully. After the ship docked, Hudson was hospitalized for psychiatric observation before being released to a relative, and family text messages referenced in court suggested he can't remember anything. I'm not going to armchair diagnose a teenager, and neither should anyone watching. But these details flag questions a court may have to confront: his state of mind, his capacity, and whether a 16-year-old psychology factors into how this is tried, and, if it ever comes to it, sentenced. Because the stakes are absolute. If convicted, he faces a maximum of life in prison. A life sentence for someone who can't legally vote or buy a lottery ticket. The law has decided he can be tried as an adult. Whether that fully sits right is a question this case is going to make a lot of people ask. And there's one more, pointed not at Hudson but at the grown-ups. A relative on his side publicly asked why two teenagers were placed alone in a shared cabin and raised questions about supervision, alcohol, and medication. The Kepners have denied giving the teens alcohol. That argument may never reach a verdict. It's not what Hudson is charged with, but it speaks to a harder, sadder question hanging over the whole story. Was this preventable, and by whom? So line them up. A DNA case with an unexplained extra profile. A sealed filing nobody outside the court has read. A timeline built from cameras and a stopped heartbeat, but no witness in the room. A defendant whose own account hasn't been heard and whose age complicates everything. And a set of questions about the adults that a criminal trial may never formally answer. None of that means Hudson is innocent. The government clearly believes its evidence is strong, and a judge called its rape case beyond clear and convincing for the narrow purpose of detention. But strong enough to charge and strong enough to convict beyond a reasonable doubt are different mountains, and only one of them has been climbed. That climb starts in September. 12 people, the full evidence, both stories, and a verdict that will finally turn all of these open questions into answers. Until then, the only honest place to stand is exactly here, in the not yet known. Step back from this one family for a moment, because Anna's death didn't just land in a courtroom. It landed in one of the strangest, least understood corners of American law, the place where a crime happens on water that belongs to no country at all. When Anna died, the Carnival Horizon wasn't in Florida. It wasn't in anyone's territory. Once a cruise ship sails far enough offshore, it's in international waters, and the default rule is that the law of the country whose flag it flies takes first priority. Many cruise ships fly foreign flags: Panama, the Bahamas, Malta. On paper, a single deck can sit inside 2 or 3 legal systems at once. So why the FBI? Because U.S. law lets federal agents step in when an American is the victim or the accused of a serious crime at sea, especially on a voyage that begins or ends at a U.S. port. Anna was a U.S. citizen. The ship sailed out of Miami and was heading back to Miami. That combination is what handed the case to the FBI's Miami office and put it in federal court. And it's why a 16-year-old from Florida is now a federal defendant rather than a state one. There's a specific law underneath all this. Since 2010, the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act has required cruise lines to report a defined set of serious incidents to U.S. authorities: homicides, suspicious deaths, missing Americans, and sexual assault among them. When ship security flags one of those, it routes up to the FBI, which decides jurisdiction and usually boards when the ship docks, focused on protecting life and preserving the scene. That's the machinery that met the horizon at the pier on November 8th. But here's what that machinery is up against, and it's important, because it cuts in favor of caution, not certainty. Investigating a crime at sea is genuinely harder than on land. There's no police force aboard. A medical examiner may have to be flown in to work far outside their usual setting, which experts say can introduce problems into the forensic work. Parts of an investigation can fall to foreign agencies, and there's often pressure to move fast before a ship has to sail again. One recurring theme from FBI agents who work these cases: alcohol is frequently a factor, and delayed reporting is a constant obstacle. I raise that not to undercut the evidence in Anna's case. The FBI clearly built a substantial file here, but because it's the honest backdrop. Cruise cases are difficult terrain, which is exactly why both sides will fight hard over how the evidence was gathered. And cases like this do reach verdicts. A man named Kenneth Manzanares was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison for killing his wife aboard a cruise ship in waters off Alaska. In another case, a husband was eventually tried and convicted after his ex-wife vanished from a Mediterranean cruise. Justice at sea is slow and complicated, but it is not impossible. That's the lane Anna's case is now traveling. There's a second way this case reaches beyond itself, and it's the harder one. This is a story about prosecuting a child as an adult, and the law has been visibly uneasy about it the whole way. Remember the sequence. Charged first as a juvenile, Hudson was allowed to live with his uncle under monitoring, because the framework for juveniles leans toward release. It was only after a grand jury indicted him as an adult that the Bail Reform Act took over and the calculus flipped toward detention. Same defendant, same alleged facts, different label, and a completely different answer about whether he sits at home or in a cell. The judge himself put the tension into words. At one hearing, Torres remarked that if the defendant had been 20 under identical circumstances, he likely would have ordered him detained from the start. In other words, the court was openly weighing the defendant's youth as a reason for restraint, right up until the law reclassified him. And the same fact that complicated his detention also set the ceiling on his punishment. Because he's a minor, this was never a death penalty case. His age took capital punishment off the table. If convicted, the maximum he faces is life in prison. Sit with the whole shape of that. A teenager's age is, at once, the reason he can't be executed, the reason he was briefly free, and a thing prosecutors had to work around to jail him. The system keeps reaching for a category, child or adult, and this case keeps refusing to fit cleanly into either. That's the larger weight of it. Anna Kepner's death is a private tragedy for two families fused by one marriage. But it's also a stress test of how America investigates deaths on the open ocean and of how it decides when a 16-year-old stops being treated as a kid. Neither of those questions gets a clean answer in September, but both of them are why this case will be studied long after the verdict. We've spent a lot of this story in courtrooms and sealed filings and the cold grammar of jurisdiction. So before we close, I want to go back to the one person all of it is actually about and give her the last real space in this story, the way she should have it. Her name was Anna Kepner. The people who loved her describe a happy, bubbly straight-A student with a bright future in front of her. A kid who made TikToks, who practiced new makeup looks, who built playlists for days out on the boat, and dragged her younger siblings along to the fun. The kind of teenager who fills a room without trying to. And she was a kid with a plan, which is the detail I keep coming back to. She wanted to join the Navy after graduation and then become a K-9 police officer. She loved animals, dolphins and butterflies especially. She dreamed of cheering for the Georgia Bulldogs. Those aren't vague teenage someday wishes. They're specific. The dogs, the uniform, the sideline in Athens. She had it mapped out. That's what makes the math of this so unbearable. Anna died in her senior year of high school. close enough to the finish line to see all of it, and stopped just short. Visual. Exterior, a quiet church, then a high school parking lot. When her town said goodbye, they did it her way. At her celebration of life, the family asked people not to wear black, to wear colors instead, in honor of who she was. Her favorite was blue. And instead of flowers at the service, they asked friends to leave flowers on Anna's car, still parked at Temple Christian School. I keep picturing that. A teenager's car in a high school lot, slowly disappearing under flowers, because the girl who drove it isn't coming back for it. There's no courtroom detail in this entire case as heavy as that one ordinary image. And here's the thing about grief on a timeline like this one. It doesn't pause for the legal process. It runs straight through it. This past weekend, Anna's family marked her birthday, the first one without her. They spent it together, celebrating her life and honoring her memory, and they said plainly that birthdays will never be the same. That happened in the same news cycle as the detention order, the sealed evidence, the legal maneuvering. While lawyers argued over custody and jurisdiction, a family was lighting candles for a daughter who would have turned 19. That's the part the formula version of a true crime story tends to skip. It treats the victim as the inciting incident, the body that starts the plot. But Anna isn't the inciting incident. She's the whole reason any of this matters. The investigation, the indictment, the trial in September, none of it is the point. She's the point. So what remains? For the law, a trial date. In September, a jury will hear the government's case and the defense's and decide what the evidence proves. Anna's father has said the family is placing its trust in the justice system to find the truth. That process is still ahead, and this video doesn't get to skip to its ending, because there isn't one yet. For two families, something with no clean resolution at all. A marriage joined the Kepners and the Hudsons. A death has cleaved them down the middle. Other children still live inside that fractured household, a fact even the judge flagged with concern. Whatever the verdict, those kids inherit this. There's no jury instruction that fixes that. And for everyone watching from the outside, maybe this, a reminder of how fragile the ordinary is. This was supposed to be a first family vacation, a blended family's hopeful, unremarkable week at sea. The most routine thing in the world. That's what makes it land. It wasn't a dark alley or a high-risk life. It was a cruise. A girl with a stomachache who went back to her cabin early. The horror of this case is partly how close it sits to the most normal day imaginable. I'm not going to tell you how to feel about Timothy Hudson. That's not mine to assign, and it's not settled. He's pleaded not guilty, and 12 people who haven't watched this video will decide what the evidence means. When they do, this story will have its legal ending. But it will never have a satisfying one. There's no verdict that returns a Navy enlistment, or a college cheer squad, or a 19th birthday. The justice system, at its very best, can deliver accountability. It cannot deliver Anna back. So let the last word here be hers, not the case's. Anna Banana. Sunshine. The girl who loved the water and the dogs and the bright colors, who made the people around her feel seen. 18 years old. A whole life drawn up and waiting. That's who we were really talking about this entire time. Every story like this one ends with people wanting a single answer. Did he do it? And in September, 12 people will give one. Guilty or not guilty, the binary the law is built to deliver. But I want to be honest with you in this final stretch, because the most useful thing I can leave you with isn't a prediction. It's the recognition that this case is asking harder questions than the one a verdict resolves. And those questions don't go away no matter what the jury decides. A verdict will settle the legal question. The government will lay out its case, the DNA, the surveillance timeline, the stopped Apple Watch, the smashed phone, and the defense will test every piece of it. The unexplained DNA from an unidentified male, the sealed evidence none of us has seen, the account Hudson has reportedly given consistently, all of it goes in front of a jury that, unlike anyone online right now, will see the whole file. They'll apply the highest standard the law has, beyond a reasonable doubt. And whatever they conclude, that conclusion deserves more weight than any theory built from headlines, including this one. So if you take nothing else from this, Timothy Hudson has pleaded not guilty, and until that jury speaks, he is, in the eyes of the law and in the only honest framing of this story, accused, not convicted. That isn't a technicality I'm tacking on at the end. It's the spine of how a case like this is supposed to be told. But a verdict won't settle the other questions. And those are the ones worth sitting with. The first is about age. This case has forced a court to keep deciding, over and over, whether a 16-year-old should be treated as a child or as an adult. And the answer kept changing depending on which law was applied that week. His youth is why he can't be executed. His youth is why he was briefly free. His youth is why he'll be held in a juvenile facility even as he's prosecuted as an adult. Whatever the jury decides about the facts, it won't resolve the deeper unease the whole case exposes, that our system doesn't actually know what to do with a teenager accused of an adult's crime, and tends to reach for whichever category the moment demands. The second is about the adults. A relative on Hudson's side asked publicly why two teenagers were placed alone in a shared cabin and raised questions about supervision. The Kepners have denied giving the teens alcohol. That argument isn't what's on trial, but it gestures at a question no verdict touches, whether anything about that night was preventable, and the quieter grief of everyone now asking themselves that. And the third is about the sea itself. Anna died in a place with no police, where evidence is harder to gather and justice is slower to arrive. There's a federal law built to bring cases like hers ashore, and it worked here, at least to the point of an indictment and a trial date. But for every cruise case that reaches a courtroom, there are others that families say never get real answers at all. Anna's case is, in that narrow and bitter sense, one of the lucky ones. It has a defendant. It has a date. Here's where I'd normally tell you to weigh in. And you will. Comment sections on cases like this fill up fast, and the temptation is to arrive certain. I'd ask you to resist that, just a little. Not because your opinion doesn't matter, but because there's a real 16-year-old at one end of those comments and a real grieving family at the other, and a jury that hasn't ruled. Anna's own father said the family is putting its trust in the justice system to find the truth. That's a remarkably restrained thing for a grieving parent to say, and it's a decent model for the rest of us watching from a distance. Follow the case. Hold the questions. Wait for the verdict before you write the ending. Because the one thing that is already settled, the only thing that needs no jury, is the loss. An 18-year-old who wanted to serve in the Navy and work with dogs and cheer in Athens, Georgia, is gone. A family that came together through a marriage is living in the wreckage of that same union. And a birthday passed this month with a candle lit for a daughter who should have been turning 19. No outcome in September changes any of that. Accountability, if it comes, is necessary. It is not the same as repair. So that's the question I'll leave you with. Not did he do it, because that one's coming. It's this. When the verdict lands and the cameras leave and the case becomes a closed file, who keeps remembering Anna as a person and not as the title of a story? Her family will. Her town did, in blue. The least the rest of us can do is the same.